I have orchids at home that bloom just once a year, and I noticed the other morning that the buds were out, and it reminded me that they had just bloomed a year ago when everything was shutting down. I remember watching them as I was working from home and feeling cheered up by their color and their whimsical forms, and thinking how lucky it was that just those few weeks that we were hunkered down at home was when they happened to be blooming. Of course, it wasn't a few weeks, it was over a year, and we're still not done. But this event feels a little like spring orchids to me. Poetry encourages us to stop and reflect, sometimes on what's beautiful, sometimes on what's painful or difficult or sad. Like visual art or music, poetry touches us in very personal ways. Particularly important at this moment, poetry is able to strip away the things that divide us and shine a light on our common purpose and our shared humanity. Amanda Gorman, the young LA native who recited her timely and timeless poem, The Hill We Climb, at President Biden's inauguration, demonstrated this beautifully, evoking the dream of a nation reunited after so much crisis and pain. Her inspiring performance also reawakened the public's appreciation of poetry and opened the world of poetry to a whole new generation of people throughout this country. Today's event, Poetry, the Conscience of Culture, gives us an opportunity to hear from some of our own world-renowned poets who are here with us today to share their talent and their perspective. Our terrific moderator, David Ulin, is going to introduce you to them in just a second. David is the author or editor of a dozen books, including Sidewalking, Coming to Terms with Los Angeles, and Writing Los Angeles, a literary anthology, which won a California Book Award. David is the former book editor and book critic for the Los Angeles Times, and he has written for major publications, including the Atlantic Monthly, the Paris Review, and the New York Times. He has received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, Black Mountain Institute, and the Lannan Foundation. So I'm going to turn this program over to his capable hands. David.
Thank you, Dean Miller. And thanks to everybody for being here. And thank you to the panelists. What we are going to do, we sort of decided that we were going to start by having each of the three panelists read read a couple of poems, one of their own and one by someone else that sort of seemed to reflect this question of poetry and conscience and culture. And then we'll talk for a while, and the last 20 minutes or so of the hour, we will turn it over to questions from all of you. So I'm going to start by introducing Robin Coste Lewis, who is the outgoing. I'll introduce each of the poets as they're going to read. So Robin, we'll start with you. Robin Coste Lewis is the outgoing poet laureate of Los Angeles and a writer in residence in the English department of USC Dornsife. In 2015, her magnificent debut collection of poems, Voyage of the Sable Venus, won the National Book Award in poetry. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Paris Review, Transition, and the Best American Poetry. Please welcome Robin Coste Lewis.
Hi, everyone. I'm coming now. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. I can't see myself, so I'm just hoping you guys can see me and everything's working. Dandy. I'm really honored to Team Miller for arranging this event, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. Let's see. I've been teaching steadily poetry through the pandemic, and you know, it's just been extraordinary to think with my students about what poetry offers humanity at every turn, for every experience. You know, there have been poets there recording, excavating, exploring, celebrating, moaning, mourning, you know, what life is about. And also during this pandemic, so many people have been turning to poetry. It's just beautiful. So I thought I would read one of my favorite all-time poems by one of my favorite all-time poets. This is me playing Professor Lewis. This is Rilke's Book of Hours. It's a new translation, Love Poems to God. He's just an extraordinary poet, and one of my favorite poems of his goes like this, and I've read it almost every day for the last year. God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks with us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear. You sent out beyond your recall. Go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like flame and make big shadows I can move in. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Give me your hand. So that's Rilke, and it's from the book of Monastic Life, his book. And one of the great things of literature, every continent, every time period, is the writer wrestling with what they perceive to be God or the universe, etc. So I thought I would read one of my poems where I'm wrestling with the universe, God, etc. It's called Reason. God goes out for whiskey Friday night, staggers back Monday morning, empty-handed, no explanation. After 3 nights of not sleeping, 3 nights of listening for his footsteps, his mule sliding under my bed, I stand at the stove, giving him my back, wearing the same tight, tacky dress, same slip, same seam stockings I put on before he left. He leans on the kitchen table, waiting for me to make him his coffee. I watch the water boil, refuse to turn around, wonder how to leave him. Woman, he slurs, when have I ever done what you wanted me to do? Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was wonderful reading. Our next poet is Douglas Kearney. Douglas Kearney has published 6 books, most recently Buck Studies, winner of the Theodore Roethke Memorial Poetry Award, the CLMP Firecracker Award for Poetry, and a silver medalist for the California Book Award. The recipient of a Whiting Writers Award, he teaches creative writing at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Doug?
Thank you so much for having me here for this conversation and with this tremendous company. When I began thinking about a poem that I reach for as a kind of a balm or a kind of an unguent, because I mean, sometimes things that you rub on your body to make you feel better also are bracing or, I thought instantly of this poem by Amiri Baraka called Caba. And a part of that is because once I was giving a reading with him and I read a poem ahead of him. I read a poem and it was, full of fire and yelling and all of this. And then immediately following that, he read this poem and I was just like, okay. So this is Caba. A closed window looks down on a dirty courtyard, and Black people call across or scream across or walk across, defying physics in the stream of their will. Our world is full of sound. Our world is more lovely than anyone's, though we suffer and kill each other, and sometimes fail to walk the air. We are beautiful people, with African imaginations, full of masks and dances and swelling chants, with African eyes and noses and arms, though we sprawl in gray chains in a place full of winters, when what we want is sun. We have been captured, brothers, and we labor to make our getaway into the ancient image, into a new correspondence with ourselves and our Black family. We need magic now, we need the spells to raise up, return, destroy, and create. What will be the sacred words? And here's a poem of mine. Gosh, thank you for reading your work, Robin, as well. That was beautiful. Here's a poem of mine. It's called Close. It's for my family. The funk, recall, as most black shit, once was and is sickness. Fool, how much oogie in your GB? Our black asses been hunkered in this house, this now transitional hood. We steal away where some call white cliffs. Fool, how much mini in your pie? Baby girl's coughs been wet. She set at trilling what pops. We spit out this kitchen, bags up of chicken, bones to rank bins in the alley till soup tints no bowls. It smells close, says In, for funky, sure, since winter's steady eavesdropping, greedy Tom peeping, for 5 months near. Now, Ma's newest facial tincture since foodish out our lone loo. Fool, how much acai in your argan? What we can't eat off love, even out brown hands done. Thus, I'm gone to market. Once my son shadowed, copped kale, potatoes, milk, cereals, though now he must stir in-house in his blossom of must there, where we close. Minding my gap twixt strained neighbors, drilling, what have I touched? My hands stay on ashes, ashes, fool, how much Jergens in your palmers? Out the store, day broke to dank-ass home. Got them bleach wipes, yeah, back pushed in the cut. We keep some sickness out.
Thank you. That was wonderful. All right, our third reader is David St. John, who is a university professor and chair of the English department at USC Dornsife. He is the author of 12 collections of poetry, including Study for the World's Body, which was nominated for the National Book Award. He is a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. David?
Thanks, David. What I'd like to do is read a poem by a great Polish poet. Some of the greatest poetry of the 20th century was written in Polish. And you may know two Nobel laureates, Czesław Miłosz and Wacław Szymborska. But two of the most influential Polish poets on American poetry were a man named Zbigniew Herbert, who actually taught at Cal State LA, and the poet I'm going to read, Tadeusz Różewicz. And this is a poem called In the Middle of Life. One of the reasons post-war Polish poetry is so powerful is that after World War II, when the writers looked around their country and the atrocities there in their country, they had to create a literature that allowed them to believe that human life had value, because the evidence everywhere was that it did not. In this poem by Różewicz addresses that very explicitly. It's called In the Middle of Life. After the end of the world, after my death, I found myself in the middle of life. I created myself, constructed life, people, animals, landscapes. This is a table, I was saying. This is a table. On the table are lying bread, a knife. A knife serves to cut the bread. People nourish themselves with bread. One should love man I was learning by night and day what one should love. I answered, man. This is a window, I was saying. This is a window. Beyond the window is a garden. In the garden, I see an apple tree. The apple tree blossoms. The blossoms fall off. The fruits take form. They ripen. My father is picking up an apple. That man who is picking up an apple is my father. I was sitting on the threshold of the house. That old woman who is pulling a goat on a rope is more necessary and more precious than the 7 wonders of the world. Whoever thinks and feels that she is not necessary, he is guilty of genocide. This is a man. This is a tree. This is bread. People nourish themselves in order to live. I was repeating to myself, human life is important. Human life has great importance. The value of life surpasses the value of all the objects which man has made. Man is a great treasure. I was repeating stubbornly. This is water, I was saying. I was stroking the waves with my hand and conversing with the river. Water, I said, good water, this is I. The man talked to the water, talked to the moon, to the flowers, to the rain. He talked to the earth, to the birds, to the sky. The sky was silent. The earth was silent. If he heard a voice which flowed from the earth, from the water, from the sky, it was the voice of another man. Right after 9/11, the day after, I talked to the great poet Philip Levine, who was teaching at NYU at the time. And we said, what did you do yesterday? And he said, I held class. I took the train from Brooklyn to NYU and I held class. He said, what did you do? And I said, I held class. And he said, what did you do in the class? And I said, I read In the Middle of Life. I said, what did you do? And he said, I read In the Middle of Life. This poem of mine is one I was just talking about with Tom Seyfried of the Russian department, because it's about one of my favorite poets, the great Silver Age Russian poet, Alexander Blok. And it describes a dinner before a poetry reading I was going to give. And the couple I meet are described in the poem. Alexander Blok. One snowy night, I was smiled upon by Russian gods and found myself at dinner opposite the Moscow scholars, a married couple. He, only the world's authority on Pasternak, and she, the final word on her beloved Alexander Block. And as we talked, the evening gathered along the length of the white table, and I could only keep drinking the conversation in so deeply. I felt myself reaching back into the Black century. And at last I got up to leave in my black cashmere overcoat I'd found hanging on the back rack of a Venice thrift store, and became just another shadow about to slide wordlessly into the night. And yes, it's true. It was snowing just in upstate New York, not in Moscow or St. Petersburg, nor in any ancient page. Yet to anyone who saw me walking, I imagined myself as the most lyrical shadow alive.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. All right, I want to start by throwing a quote out from Lawrence Ferlingetti, who died this week, from a book of his, a really lovely little book he published about 13, 14 years ago called Poetry as Insurgent Art. And he writes there, if you would be a poet, create works capable of answering the challenge of apocalyptic times, even if this means sounding apocalyptic. The way I read that line is, he's basically saying to be receptive, that we're receivers first receivers, and then we make our work out of that, to listen and to engage. And I just wanted to start by asking, what does that, what does that look like for each of you, in terms of, both in terms of the way you're living, but also in the relationship of what you're living through and the work you're doing. We can sort of go in order. Anyone can go. I can call on people. I'm not shy about calling on people. I also teach. So, okay. Does anyone want to start us off?
Well, I guess in the sense of being a receiver, and thinking about apocalypse as meaning revealing, or not just the way we oftentimes think about it now as the world ending, but also a kind of uncovering, something being revealed to you which can transform. Poetry oftentimes for me unsettles both the poetry that I read, and the poetry that I write. And there's something about a kind of being stirred, or being knocked off balance a little bit, that helps me to try to find balance in the instability, to try to prepare myself for a world I can't control, and how to receive that world, receive that space with, I don't want to just say grace, right? But a kind of mindfulness. So to pay attention to what I cannot necessarily pin down. The opportunity to revise a poem doesn't have to feel like bringing order or shape. It something that I think about a lot is a verb that is oftentimes used in writing workshops is to polish, which is a process that you do to change the texture or surface of something. It's an artificial process, right? It's polishing. Distressing is also an artificial process that you could do to change the texture or a surface. And so how do we find ways to press back on certainties that we don't necessarily earn? Because I think that when you hold a certainty that isn't earned, I think it puts you into a place where you will make demands on the world that aren't that aren't yours to demand.
Yeah, poem is question, right? Rather than answer. I mean, that's always what interests me about, both as a reader and a writer. I'm always looking for the question, maybe even the question that can't be answered.
Absolutely.
Robin, do you want to jump in?
I would love to jump in. First of all, I'm still kind of both deeply moved to be with you all. I'm always deeply moved to be with these three gentlemen. To the audience, they're three of my favorite writers and also three of my favorite people, which often that doesn't go hand in hand. But it's beautiful. It's actually sublime when it does. And I'm also kind of still tingling, and I don't know what to call it. Tingling is the wrong word. Overcome from that poem In the Middle of Life, David St. John. I've never heard that poem. And David's my boss, you guys. So now I'm always like, we're always talking about teaching and work, and I just want to sit him down and say, tell me everything you know. So thank you for reading that poem, David. I will always hold it dear. Okay, reception is the question, I think, David Ulin, that you said, right? Receptivity.
Yeah, well, or being a receiver, or that question of sort of, responsiveness and reception.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'm taking notes, students. I'm a note taker. So I'm here, but I'm writing down stuff. I think about my vocation as a poet, as a calling. I used to be a scholar of ancient languages, and I often go into deep mourning about once a year that I didn't do that, because I really like being on archaeological digs. I really like going down into places. I really like translating ancient texts. And every time I get into this funk, I go, shut up, idiot. You're still doing the same work. You're an archaeologist of a different material. And with regard to this year, how I've been coping with the pandemic is I'm speaking to you guys from the tool shed in my mother's backyard that I pimped out into a little office. normally there's just like lawnmowers and stuff in here. And I thought, as the quarantine began, what would happen if you took this space, this suburban Southern California prefab neighborhood, which I jetted out of here when I was 17 to get as far away from as possible. What would happen if you looked at it like an archaeological site or an ethnographic site? And that means that I've been walking a great deal and looking at these really boring, ugly prefab homes, but thinking about this place historically, that, this neighborhood was one of the landing sites of the Great Migration. So most of the homes here are Black-owned homes, and have been Black-owned for about 60 years. That is a big deal for California. Especially because they're 4, 5, 6 bedroom homes, right? They're not South Central. And so I've been thinking about the history of property ownership and all of that, and spending a lot of time as we can, from 6 feet away, checking in on elderly people. They had geriatric community in my neighborhood. And that's been a profound experience. I would never have done that. Or the other thing, to flip the switch, is I've just been watching the sky a great deal. I have about 1,000 photographs of the sky that I've been taking over the past year. I've been basically being my own student. What I tell my students, deal with what you got, right? Deal with what's in front of you. Make work out of what's right there. And not because that's necessarily some grand thing to do, although I do think it is. I just think that every single 2 pair of eyes, or 1 pair of eye, or let's just say if you're blind, every single sensation of perception can be exalted. It has the unique individuality of consciousness. Whatever kind of consciousness is in there interests me greatly. And I do think that's what poetry is about, right? I see the St. Augustine grass that I'm looking at outside my window that my mother planted in the 1970s in a way that my sister does not. I call my sister outside and go, look at this cloud. And she's like, who cares? Right? But meanwhile, I've started writing sonnets about clouds and the global annihilation of humanity. Right?
And that's a volta.
And that's a volta. So, I feel like reception means that I try to figure out how to be as honest as I possibly can about what I see and what I feel, without the interference of my ego, without the interference of my identity. I'm much more interested in the history of the body, the history of my body, the history of the bodies around me at any given point. And that can be extended to all kinds of objects, inanimate, non-sentient, like, that's what I think poetry is about. And so I've been trying to apply that to my very quiet little 1970s suburban African-American Great Migration neighborhood, including the flora and fauna and the street dogs and the cucumber growing on the wall that no one's picked in looks like 2 years because it's 3 feet long. I mean, that kind of stuff. So I'll shut up now.
I just want to say that's really interesting because I've found something similar. For me, if the pandemic has a gift or an upside, which I hesitate to say that it does, it's that sense of being forced to be in the present because you never know what the next day yields. And I've been getting up at 6:15 to walk early in the morning because I want to stay away from too many people.
Yes.
But I've been living in this neighborhood for 20 years almost. I've never spent as much time in it at dawn. And there's something really interesting about the changing of the lens. David, I wonder about your thoughts on this question, sort of receptivity, I guess, and responsiveness in terms of the work.
Well, one of the things that I want to turn it slightly to what happens with people in their lives when what they're facing is loss. And I think that certainly this past year has never been quite so explicit in terms of our experience and the need to confront loss. I think that of all the art forms I know and love, I think poetry is perhaps the best at recuperating memory, recuperating lost time, in recovering experiences, say family experiences, kinds of moments from childhood, and bringing them into the present. And just a quick anecdote, when I began teaching at Oberlin College, 40 years ago, something began to happen that at first I didn't get. And I would be in my office and there was a main switchboard at Oberlin that would route calls to different places where they're supposed to go. It was that long ago. And what would happen is I'd get a phone call and it would be from someone outside of the college. It would be from someone who may or may not have themselves ever been to college, but they were looking for a particular poem, often a poem that they weren't poetry readers, but they had read this poem in a class in high school, maybe a survey class in college, but they couldn't remember the title and they couldn't remember the author. And so they were routed to a poet on campus. And so I would I would say, tell me a little about the poem. I'd say, what.
My God.
And, I could almost always identify the poem. The reason being, anthologies in America repeat themselves.
Right.
And so, in fact, the range wasn't that difficult, but this kept happening. And over the years, then when I, went to Johns Hopkins, it kept happening. Finally, I began to ask the people why, because the poems were so disparate, but the need was the same. And I'd say, well, can I ask you why you're looking for this poem? And the answer was always the same. They had recently lost someone in their lives, a son, a daughter, a parent, a sibling, and they simply had no language that was commensurate to their grief. But they had this experience at this moment in their life where they had read a poem, and for whatever reason, they absolutely connected with that particular poem. And they had the experience of where language and emotion and loss or hope, whatever the complex of that poem was, that it had come together for them as language. And so those poems had this totemic presence for them. They felt like if they could find that poem again and read that poem, maybe they'd also begin to be able to find language for what was inside them and what they were feeling. And you know, we're a horrible culture at providing language for what we love and what we feel and what matters most to us. And anyone who writes learns quickly that all of the things that matter most to us are also those things that most resist being said. And so we need to learn how to find the language to say those things. And one of the things that, you know, I try to share with my students is that, you know, in terms of a poetry writing class or poetry reading class, it really doesn't matter whether they go on to be poets and keep writing. But what matters is that they begin to learn how to find the language that speaks for who they are individually. Because if they can't do that, if they can only speak of themselves in the received languages of the culture, then they're just doomed always to represent themselves as really a cartoon of who they are. And especially with the people who, you know, we claim to love and who we believe love us, unless we can really say who we are to that person, we don't have the right to say he or she doesn't understand me. And it's something that I think we forget. And so poems don't only help us to excavate difficult times or wonderful times, but I think they really help us on a tremendously intimate and daily level.
Reminds me, I mean, I do want to just caution, or not caution, but alert the audience. I'm going to ask this one question. We'll talk about it for a few minutes, and then we are open to questions. So please post your questions in the Q&A, and I'll read them, and we'll call on you. But this is like poetry as breath in a certain way. I mean, we talk about breath in terms of the movement of the language, but I actually want to think about breath as like the force of life, poetry is coming from the body. I think about, Claudia Rankine talking about some of the work in Citizen, saying, the reason you feel it yet? Okay, I'll do it again. You feel it yet? I'll do it again. About being in that physical moment, and the poem the language kind of inhabiting us and animating that moment as we live it. I just want to get a sense from all of you about that quality of, again, breath, not necessarily as meter or pacing, but breath as sort of as life, and the way it moves from the poet into the poem, or from the poem into the reader. Anyone want to jump in on that?
I'd be happy to jump in. I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but I'll try. So breath. I've been thinking a lot about the discourse around poems as a trace. And this is how I think about that poem that David St. John read in the middle of life is still breathing in my body right now. And I'm really trying to focus on being on this panel, but meanwhile, I'm having a deeply aesthetic experience. I'm very moved by that poem for so many reasons, the simplicity of the language to convey the horrors of war, water, sky. I mean, just, it's crazy, bread, a knife, right? I think about poems as, I'm not alone in this, many poets do, and experience that through some, I don't know, magic that I could take out of my psyche and put it on the paper, and then the reader reads it, and then it goes into their psyche, if it's good, if I've done my job. right? And then it's breathing inside of them. I think about poems as a living, breathing experience. How that is true, I do not know. Why that is true, I do not know. But I do know that I'm not the only one who's that geeky who experiences poetry and poems as kind of these, I don't want to say animal because then people, we attach so many things to the word animal, but I do experience certain poems as taking up life inside of me, inside of my psyche. And I feel very lucky when that happens.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Robin. That I know we're not talking about meter, we're not talking about line breaks when we speak about breath, and yet that to me is a part of what makes the poem as the living organism, how it lives in you. Something we were discussing in email was this idea of inspiration, which is breathe into. And we usually think of inspiration, I shouldn't say we, maybe some people, but I oftentimes hear inspiration represented as a kind of like a light bulb or but to imagine being breathed into, when does that happen in your life? It's when you're dying. Somebody, is trying to save you. So a poem as inspiration, if you are to be the one writing it, it's to be breathed into by something from somewhere else and ruptured and shaken inside in that way. And that having a different breath in your body then is a change of life, right? Your life is now no longer the same thing it was because there's a different breath feeding your blood. There's something in that. And if you're not to write a poem, and a poem like what David was saying earlier about people calling out to specific poems, people wanting to re-inhabit a memory, to be inspired by a poem that you're listening to and to be inspired. I don't understand the idea of inspiration that doesn't actually change your life. I mean, there's stimuli, like, oh, that smells good, I will eat that. But that's not inspiration. Inspiration, I think, changes you.
Yeah.
And so having a poem inside you, whether it's one that you're very well familiar with and you just walk around with it, or it's one that's been breathed into you just brand new and you're still in that aesthetic experience that Robin was talking about. There are poems that I know and love where there's one word in them that I just worry over it, like why did they pick that word? Why did they pick that word? Why did they pick that word? And that's somebody who is not me, who's passed on, who wasn't living anywhere near where I lived, and yet there's a kind of time travel. Something I tell my students, that writing is time travel and telepathy, right? It's time travel and telepathy. You watch the movie Inception and you go, oh my gosh, look at those special effects. Poetry's been incepting, right? That's what it is. So yeah, that's one of the ways I think about it.
Can I just jump in just for a second? I just want to say to the audience that your choice of verb, Doug, was so great. Inspire, it's like in breathe and inhale. Inspires roots etymologically is about taking in breath. And I don't think it's a coincidence.
David, do you have something you want to add to this?
Yeah, those were both such spectacular answers. I'll just say really quickly that, poems aren't arguments. They don't convince the way essays convince. Poems are pieces of music. And they convince by the power of the music of one's sensibility and imagination. And, it's important that people remember that poems aren't these two-dimensional things, pressed like leaves between the pages of an anthology. They're actually living, breathing voices of someone else, and as Doug said, across time. And if anyone ever has trouble understanding the poem. I just tell them, stand up out of your chair and read the poem out loud and let that poem live inside your body and be
Mhm.
carried out into the world on your
That's
breath.
it. That's
It's
it.
that
Yes.
simple to me.
That's
Yes.
it. That's it.
I think that's a great place for us to end this part of the conversation. We have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to just start with Claudia Ellis's question. What new themes and obsessions, if any, have found you during the pandemic? Robin, we heard a little bit about some of yours. How do you go about embracing these discoveries? And I think this is a general question for anyone on the panel who wants to take it.
I'll start. I don't mind. Um, I think about spirituality a lot more. What is the nature of belief? I think about something I think about a lot is a poetics of joy as distinct from happiness, right? There's happiness, but I also think about joy, and I think about um, tension between writing about joy with that same questioning that David Ulin and we were talking about earlier. Like I don't want to question joy the same way I want to question pain. Like there's something about joy that I just want to leave it. I want to just have it. It's like it's like being at the most beautiful moment in your life and picking up a camera and taking a picture of the moment. Like at some level, there'd be a picking something apart while I was trying to watch it fly. I don't, I'm throwing a lot of a lot of similes and metaphors, which is always a sign of trouble for me. So there we go. Yeah.
We're watching the process in action.
Right.
Other thoughts, David or Ram? Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Robin, go ahead.
You know, this is going to be a strange way of answering it, but a lot of people have died in my life this year, and probably so many people's in the audience's life. I decided to stop counting and to stop listening because I was getting overwhelmed by grief. And that's why that poem, for so many reasons that David St. John read today in the middle of life, has moved me so deeply, because I feel like my reasons for going to poetry before I became a poet, I would probably be the one calling David St. John up in the past on that telephone. I love it, David. You had a poetry hotline, right? Would be to help me understand the overwhelming experience of beauty, of what it means to love someone and then have the body no longer there. And speaking of the trace, right? The trace kind of, for me, when I read poems, can bring the exchange of that relationship back. So for example, I write about my father's death a lot, or at least I used to. I don't so much anymore. I don't know how to answer this question, I guess, is really what I'm trying to say, except that I felt a profound generosity in myself that I don't normally have for people around me, and just tenderness, profound tenderness. I assume that everyone is suffering right now, everyone from any camp in any direction, that it's impossible that we're not all suffering. And it's so strange that we are having the emotions of a war and the experience that other people and sensations that other people have had at different times, other humans have had when there's a war, but physically outside it doesn't look like a war. That kind of disjunction has really made me think a great deal about how to be present and respond to a situation. I really don't know how to answer this question. I wish I did, except to say that I've been trying to encourage myself and others around me to be very gentle and that sounds very, all the sound, when you're a woman and you say these words, people are all like unicorns, rainbows, flowers. That's not at all where I'm coming from. I just want to be clear, right? I'm not that kind of writer. I'm talking about that it's profoundly hard to be gentle to people who might be, you know, not of the same political party as you, or profoundly tender to someone who might not believe you have the right to exist, right? Or the commonality of collective loss, you know, like this house down the street lost 3 people, this house down the street lost 2, this house over here, I lost 8 friends in New York. Like I'm sure people we're all losing people. And I love what you said about joy, because for me, what I have been doing is also listening to crazy amounts of music, just crazy amounts of, you know, music that I didn't even remember I knew from my childhood, trying to understand a life that has been lost, right? So I don't know how to answer this question, because honestly, I don't think it's an answerable question, David, right? It's just a profound moment we're going through, and we'll be unpacking it, I think, for generations, the same way we've been unpacking World War II for generations, right? And I hope we will continue to. It's just such a profound moment. And so I'm just trying to stay, I love what David said, stand up, say the poem, then you'll understand it. I feel this, or then you'll experience it. I feel the same way about this moment. I guess what I'm trying to say is metaphorically what I'm trying to do with this moment where it is standing up and trying to feel it. And then maybe I'll understand it better.
It's interesting. I was just having conversation with students about this yesterday, about the fact that, you know, we will at some point, humanity will look back at this as a historical event, and it will be fixed. It will have kind of the architecture of a story, but living through it is completely different. And it, you know, we don't have that context, and all we have is what's happening in the moment. So I think that's a great answer to this question. David, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, just something, again, I just want to say poems are experiences. And that's one of the things that Robin and Doug have both said this. I just want to emphasize the importance of that. And, you know, Susan McCabe had an interesting question.
I was just about to voice that question. So do you want me to read it out, and then you can answer?
Please, yeah.
So the question is, tenderness, joy, and all these practices. This is a period of, quote, life that has been lost, Robin, and archaeology of memory, David. Thank you all for standing up. How do we give this flexibility to students without making them feel too open or too raw?
Yeah.
It's so great.
Yeah. I mean, one of the difficulties in a time like this that's so filled with fear and a sense of threat is, how does one remain open to possibility, to experience? And what Galway Canal, great poet Galway Canal, called in his book, The Book of Nightmares, he has this great phrase that he uses called tenderness towards existence. And everything that we really also want to do as poets, having to do with looking at the natural world, looking at the environment, looking at the crises that are daily around us, and trying to reckon with those kinds of fears as well. And I guess what I would answer to Susan, who of course is herself a great scholar and poet, is that we can never relinquish the determination to make discoveries. If we don't push for these discoveries in our work, in our experience, and in our lives, then we have no possibility of finding those things that help reckon with this great uncertainty. We can't solve uncertainty, but we can understand how we experience belief and hope and what we value. And as writers, our desire is to find the language to share that discovery and those hopes for some future time.
Might I jump in
Yeah.
quickly to Susan's question? I want to answer the part of Susan's question about how to hold a space for the students in the classroom and not leave them, I guess, open in a way that isn't helpful for them. One of the things I've been doing is in my workshops is I have the students write the moment they sit down. And I just say, you know, where are you today around the quarantine, right? Where are you today around what's happening in the world? Just write for 5 minutes. And then I might ask them some other questions. I also tell them that the classroom is a refuge and that this is the place where they can just do poetry if they want, or talk about other things. Nothing's off the table. And I remind them exactly what David said, David St. John earlier, and Doug also, just that poetry can hold the moment, right? There's a reason why poetry book sales are up more than they've ever been right now in memory, right? Because poetry is that strong an art form, right? It actually can really hold anything that life has thrown at poetry. Poetry has embraced it and given it back to humanity. And so, you know, we'll read poems, or they'll read poems, or we'll talk about the power of silence, and they can write about the power of not being able to articulate things. I guess the short stories I try to tell them anything goes right now with whatever they're feeling, that all of those feelings are completely normative and to be expected. And we're all, you know, in this collective state of trauma and loss and shock and relief and grief and all these things. And so anything is game.
Doug, do you want to jump in on this question too?
Oh, I'll be super brief. I just say time. If we're working with poetry and something hits us, there's no reason to turn it into some kind of assembly line of information. Got to keep production up, got to cram more stuff. Like, stop. You stop.
Yeah.
You know, you check in on each other, but it's not food that you don't read a poem to get to the end. Right. Getting to the end of a poem is not the same thing as getting to the end of a short story. That's not, it's, you know, as David St. John said earlier, it's a piece of music. So there's going to be recursion. An image that David taught me when I was his student at Cal Arts is that poetry works in the same way that a mobile works. That when you look at it just sitting there, it's just an assemblage. But once they start spinning, right, staying in place and spinning, they create new relations and dynamic relations to each other and then to your perception. So, you know, looking at a mobile like this, okay, I've seen the mobile, isn't that the point? You look at a mobile like that. So you got to be, if you're not ready to give people time, or you haven't built time into your class, then I think it's sad to say that I think it's a radical thing to do in a classroom to stop.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. And I just want to say quickly, we're basically out of time, but I completely agree. For me, poetry is an art of uncertainty in some way, of creating a space for uncertainty. It's not, again, it's about the question, not the answer. And also an art of rereading. I never get a poem the first time around, or even the 5th time around, or maybe even the 35th time around. I keep going back. And the poems that resonate the most for me are the ones that I keep going back to and have over the course of years or even decades, and I'm still kind of teasing out, wrestling with it. Nothing I like better than finding a new poem and sitting and reading like 30 times in a row because I need to get inside the lines in some way. Anyway, we are out of time. I want to first thank the panelists. This was really, really wonderful. I've been inspired in the Doug Kearney sense of inspired. Will be inspired and disturbed for in the best ways for the rest of, at least for the rest of the day, I'm sure. I want to thank Dornsife. I want to thank for putting this together. I want to thank all of you for coming. I should let everyone know that there is today's Dornsife dialogue will be immediately available to view on Facebook following this session. The link is in the chat if you want to take a look and revisit it. And thank you all for being here and for taking an hour out on a Friday to talk about something really important and valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, David Ulin, too, for
Thank you,
being such
David.
an extraordinary colleague and writer and part
Thanks
of
to
our
everyone.
community. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me again.